Okay, so this is about seeing as it looks from the viewpoint of vision science. So I'm going to start with the role of concepts in seeing as. According to Brian O'Shaughnessy, says that Wittgenstein thought that seeing was always conceptual. He puts it that, he quotes Wittgenstein saying that the work of the understanding lies at the center of visual perceptual experience, and he quotes things like, I do not merely interpret a figure, but I clothe it with the interpretation. But the real work of this interpretation has to do with Wittgenstein's notion of seeing under an aspect. Of course, Wittgenstein is famously hard to interpret. You don't always know whether he's attributing a view to himself or he's expressing a view or attributing it to his opponent. In any case, this view that seeing is always conceptual is stated much more unambivalently and clearly by Jerry Fodor for quite different reasons from Wittgenstein, I'm sure. And here's what Fodor says. He says, there's no seeing a thing without seeing it as something or other. And when something looks to you to be something or other, you must have some or other concept that it looks to you to fall under. So the chain of inference goes, no seeing without seeing as, no seeing as without conceptualization, no conceptualization without concepts. Thus two intentionality and conceptualization enter into the philosophy of perception, and they enter very early. So I do think there's a sense of seeing as in which you could speak of seeing as conceptual, but I think it's really important to see the kinds of seeing as in which it's not conceptual. So let's go into Fodor's reasons for this. I think they're bad reasons. He says, all the perceptual representations that are accessible to consciousness exhibit constancy effects, and by pretty general consensus, constancy effects are the products of inferences. You cannot, for example, see the retinal color of a thing, the color of the light the thing actually reflects to the eye, and then he speaks of inferences that correct for color. Here's a familiar phenomenon. So that guy back there, that very little piece of image can be moved to the front. It looks very weird, whereas back here, it looks like a normal-sized person in the background. And this kind of reflects the extent, here's a few more of them, the extent to which, if you haven't encountered this before, the size constancy is a surprising thing. And according, what Fodor says is that by pretty general consensus, constancy effects are the products of inferences, and this is an idea that comes from Helmholtz. I myself think this is a pernicious metaphor. There are some similarities between those subpersonal computations and inference. I do not think it justifies the attribution of concepts. But anyway, that is Fodor's reason. So his argument is this: no seeing without seeing as, no seeing as without conceptualization, no conceptualization without concepts. Here is now of course, to some extent, the way you use the word concept is, you can use it many different ways. He's entitled to his own use. But here is an alternative point of view, which I think is a better point of view. This is a Burge's picture in The Origins of Objectivity. And the important terminology here is between the properties of things in the world, which he calls attributes, and the mental representations postulated by vision science, which he calls attributives. And here's a sort of summary picture. The idea is you've got an attribute, the color of the fire hydrant. Sensory transducers transduce that property. You get a percept, which he says could be put in language in this form, that F. But the point of that form isn't that the visual system has the word that in it. It's that there's a singular, that in a percept there's a singular element and a perceptual attributive. And the singular element can refer to an object, a property, instance, an event. And the next stage is a basic perceptual judgment or belief, where you can have a conceptualized version of the attributive, and then a non-basic belief or judgment. And the idea is that this is the upper border and lower border of perception. So when you have a percept of the form that F, the idea is that, so for example, that face, I could be said to see the item as a face, but seeing as in that sense is not conceptual, and there needn't be a perceptual judgment involving a concept. Now when I say it's not conceptual, I'm using the term concept to mean something like elements in a propositional structure that are apt to be constituents of thought. So that's really just a definition. But the main point against Fodor is that the trouble with this argument is that the second premise is wrong in the sense of concept that I'm talking about. And in addition, that intentionality enters with just perceptual representation. You don't need the concepts. Now, of course, as I said, it's a verbal issue how to use the word concept. But what's not a verbal issue is that, in my view, is that there's a joint in nature between perception and cognition, and that there is a form of seeing as that falls on the perception side. Now, this is, I have to concede that this is a topic of much controversy today as to whether there is really a joint in nature, and I can't get into that because I'm kind of doing other things in this talk, but maybe that'll come up in the question period and we can talk about it. The key here is the perception-conception distinction, or perception-cognition distinction. And just to be clear, what I'm suggesting is that it's a matter of computational role and format. So the computational role, roughly, perception is encapsulated. Cognition is, in Stitch's terms, inferentially promiscuous. So if you get reasoning of that form, then you know you're in the realm of concepts and cognition. So, and that's often used as a diagnostic for cognition. So the format, the concepts are predicative elements in a propositional structure, apt to be constituents of thought, which is, of course, where Fodor disagrees. Another way to think about it is that the other side of that is that percepts have something like an iconic form. Okay, so this is a perspective that I haven't really argued for, but I've claimed is implicit in vision science. So using this sort of set of concepts, we can ask the question, well, what are the perceptual attributives? Now, in his review of Burge's book, Andre, or maybe it's Endre Begbie, says, by the way, I like the review. I don't mean to, but I disagree with a lot of the things in it. I'm going to mention some of the things. He says, he, being Burge, acknowledges, however, that we also have perceptual beliefs which are not thus basic, but rather perceptual in a broader sense, namely those that involve familiar everyday objects, such as baseball bats, CD players, hybrid autos, and so on. What can we say about these? Burge's response is, to my mind, a letdown. While they, that is the wider perception in the wider, looser sense, while they do not involve conceptualizations of perceptual attributives, they nonetheless depend for their empirical application on perceptual attributives. Attributives for baseball bats depend for their application on size, shape, color that baseball bats in fact have. The implication, if I understand Burge here, is that we do not perceive CD players and baseball bats, but only reliably form beliefs about their presence on the basis of perceiving attributes such as color, shape, and texture. Now, when he says do not perceive, he means do not perceive as such. I mean, he is, of course, he agrees that you perceive baseball bats. It's just that what he's attributing to Burge is that we don't have attributives for baseball bats. So we can ask the question, how do we know? How can we know about this? Now I'm going to mention Susanna Siegel's what she calls the rich content thesis, that the representational contents of visual experience go beyond basic visual detection. This is actually my list, not hers. Shape, spatial relations, motion, texture, brightness, color, body. So that's a list of low-level properties. In addition, one can suppose that maybe perception involves representation of high-level properties, that is, involves high-level attributives, and some of the ones that Susanna suggests are causation, being a dog, being a pine tree, and even individual properties like being John Malkovich. So the terminology here is that corresponding to these low and high-level attributes, we have low and high-level attributives. So how are we going to think about how to find out what those attributives are? So one possibility is that if they're learned, if an attributive can be learned, maybe that shows it's high level. Okay, so I don't think that's going to work, and my argument for this, one argument for this depends on work by Mary Peterson. I'm using her very old paper, but she's done much more work on this topic. So the idea is you're more likely to see the white as figure in these than in these. And in case you haven't noticed, these differ from these by inversion. And these are kind of familiar shapes, a standing woman, a face. These are inverted standing woman, inverted face. You're less likely to see the white in figure. Of course, you're most likely to see the black as figure because the Gestalt principles dictate seeing the black as figure, but people can get the white as figure, and they do get the white as figure. Now, what does it mean to get the white as figure? So the idea of figure versus in figure versus ground, the figure appears closer, appears smaller, has more of a shape, appears more thing-like. Maybe it's more attention attracting, but that may be because of the other things. So these are seem to be low-level properties, and there's plenty of evidence, which I won't go into, that what's going on here is low-level contour representations, and that the visual system is sensitive to the contours in the environment and adapts its figure-ground segregation to match them. So, but they're low level, so they're not high level. So the fact that our perceptual expertise improves with experience does not show that we perceive high level properties. So far we're at ground zero. But here at least let's distinguish between the following questions. One is, are there any high level attributives? Like face or cause, that is not just color. I'll use the phrase color, shapes, and textures to abbreviate that long list. Second question is, can we acquire new high-level perceptual attributives? And a third and quite interesting question is, are there culturally constructed high-level perceptual attributives that we don't share with other primates? Like, maybe you might suggest CD player and baseball bat. Although I think there are more plausible examples than that. So here's what I'm going to do. I'm going to mention what I call the recognitional coextension problem. And then I'm going to give my purported solution, which is a method of finding out what attributives the visual system, what attributives are we use in seeing something as something. Then I'll say something about primary versus secondary seeing and personal versus subpersonal, and go on from there. So the recognitional coextension problem, what is that? Well, that's the problem that although we certainly feel intuitively that we see a face as a face, the properties we're attributing might just be family resemblance clusters, and I just typed in family to Google image search and got this. Family resemblance clusters of low-level shape properties. And it is known that it's very easy for us to learn such clusters. An old experiment uses this Posner paradigm where they produced random dot pictures and distortions, low distortions, high distortions, and gave that a name. And people have found it very easy to pick out one from another. You can learn those very easily. And actually there's more interesting work done on this. Even small children find it very easy to learn names for pretty arbitrary, pretty disjunctive categories, visual categories. So the recognitional coextension problem is, how can we tell whether a perceptual attributive is an attributive for faces as opposed to a family resemblance cluster of recognitionally coextensive low-level perceptual attributives? The terminology here is that a high-level attributive is recognitionally coextensive to a low-level attributive or a cluster of them if they are coextensive to the extent that we can recognize them. I'm not saying that there is a cluster of low-level properties that is coextensive with being a face, but there's reason to think there is such a thing coextensive with looking like a face. But here let's ask the question whether there are such family resemblance clusters, and if yes, the problem is how can we decide whether when we see a face we're using those rather than the attributive face or something like that. And if no, you might wonder how the visual system can detect faces to the extent that it does. So I think the answer here is yes, and that's the problem we have. And that's because there can be pretty much bottom-up face recognition. And one sort of series of experiments that suggest this is experiments by Molly Potter that shows that you can recognize pretty complicated things very, very, very quickly. An old study of hers showed that at 6 per second you could recognize, these are her pictures, you could, given a description, you could pair them, a description of this sort: small boats on the water at a beach, couple in the water at a beach, a road with cars, a girl sitting in bed. Now, of course, here the description comes first, which seems like, it doesn't show its bottom up, but she also showed that you can actually get the description second. And then later work speeds it up even more. And if you look at the time course of the feed forward from the visual areas in the back of the head to the frontal lobes that are registering some of these categories, it looks like there just isn't time for much feedback. So the upshot is we can recognize objects with little or no feedback processing. Some objects, not all categories can be done. And so then we have to, so then it looks like we're in this branch of this dilemma, and we have to answer the question of how we can distinguish a high-level attributive from recognitionally equivalent low-level attributives. So one sort of line of thought that I think won't work is the kind of behaviorist idea that maybe Wittgenstein was expressing when he said what is in question is an inclination to do one thing or the other. The point is I can see a face as a cluster of colors, shapes, and textures, but be inclined to treat it as a face, even immediately inclined, because of an immediate connection between perception and basic perceptual judgment. So in general, what people are inclined to do in the sense of categorize, you won't get you won't distinguish perception from perceptual judgment that way. You have to use something more, according to me anyway, something more experimental. So the first problem then is the recognitional coextension problem, distinguishing high-level properties from clusters of low-level properties. The second problem is distinguishing a high-level or a low-level perceptual attributive from a cognitive attributive. So here is an example that illustrates this. So these are the familiar things, probably everybody's seen these. So most people say when they see that it looks as if the first event caused the second event. And in this one, it looks as if the first one didn't cause, or maybe it causes in a different way. So the problem here is that although that first one looks causal in some sense, it's not clear that we can tell from introspection that the causal aspect of it is genuinely perceptual as opposed to some kind of an overlay of perceptual judgment on a low-level percept. So that sets up the need for a way of doing this, and I'm going to suggest a method. I think there are a number of methods that can be used, but one that I think is quite powerful is the method of looking at adaptation. So this has been called by John Frisbee the electrode of psychophysics. The idea is that just as the physiologist can boost or can tweak the activation of cells using an electrode, the psychophysicist can do the same thing using adaptation. Okay, so here's the idea. So stare at this, fixate there, stare at that thing for about 30 seconds. You really have to do this if you're going to get the phenomenon. So I'm going to time it. Then I'm going to show you another grid, and you have to say whether it looks at all tilted to the left or to the right. So you have to say, let's make it forced choice. You have to say left or right, meaning right meaning tilted slightly clockwise like this one, or left meaning tilted slightly counterclockwise. And you ready, set, when I say go, shout. Okay, look, yeah, all right, good. Now let's do the same thing with this. Okay, so when I say go, shout left or right. 1, 2, 3, go. Okay, so it's the same one you saw. First it looked tilted to the left, then it looked tilted to the right. Everybody get that? Okay, so here's the explanation. We have receptors in the visual system that are tuned to different orientations. So when the vertical stripes look vertical, we're getting sensitivity of channels all equal and a higher response in the in this direction. So it looks. So then we stare at this thing, and then we get a higher response in these channels over to the right, and then they become quote fatigued, and then they're not responding equally, and then when we see this, those fatigued receptors aren't firing as much, and so we have a dominance of the left receptors. So that's the explanation. So a principle relating to this kind of adaptation is if extended exposure to one of a set of attributes lowers the level of activation of the corresponding attributive, resulting in the domination of other attributives in the set in the overall detection state, that attributive is at least in part perceptual. Okay, now we're going to do another one. And okay, I need you to stare at this for 30 seconds. Then I'm going to show you a picture, and you're going to have to say, does it look a little angry or a little fearful? A little bit on the angry side or a little bit on the fearful side. So you have to respond one way or the other. Okay, well, I'm going to say 1, 2, 3, and you have to say immediately angry or fearful. Angry. Okay, now we'll do this one. You see where this is going. I hope that doesn't contaminate the results. Stare at that. Okay, so it's going to be 1, 2, 3, angry or fearful. Okay, and again, it's the same thing. This is a morph. This is fearful. This is angry. This is a morph of the two. Ambiguous figure. It looks like something pretty similar was going on with this expression stuff that happened before. So again, the principle suggests that we have some kind of attributive for angry, attributive for fearful. The attributive for angry gets quote fatigued, and you can do. I won't do this, but I'll just show you the displaces for masculine and feminine. So this is a more feminine face, a more masculine face. This is a morph, and a similar thing happens for that. You can turn the light back on. Okay, so since adaptation affects the look of fearful or angry and the look of masculine or feminine, can't we conclude that visual representations of fearfulness, anger, masculinity, and femininity are modulated by adaptation? So I think this makes a prima facie case, and that's basically one of the big points I'm making, which is that when you get adaptation, that's a prima facie case for an attributive for the adapted property. However, a little more work needs to be done to nail down whether it's really a high-level attributive or congeries of low-level attributives. So one kind of thing that can be done in this, and I don't have a slide for it, but I have a slide that is, I don't have a real slide, I have a slide that I made up, is you can get face effects almost as big, even when you move the face around, change a lot of its low-level features, and here's an example. And I just move these around, change their... Actually, I have a better case, but it uses a somewhat different method that I don't want to go into, but the idea is that you have pictures of this, of the same person from with various things not held constant, and you still get the effect. It's the identity of this. In this case, it's identity of a person. That's relevant. But the same thing works for gender and expressions. So you vary the low-level properties, and you still get the effect, although not as great, suggesting that it's a combination of an effect of low-level properties and high-level properties. That is, there are low-level attributives and high-level attributives. They both contribute to the adaptation. But the important point for my case is there is evidence. It provides evidence for high-level attributives. Here is a really cool experiment. Came from Eleanor McCone's lab. One of the things I love is that philosophers often think that there's no way of showing something, and that's because they just haven't sort of examined all the clever things that people can do to. Anyway, here's a really cool idea. So the idea that she uses is that if you many things can look elongated or squat, or in between, and one interesting fact about this is that if you adapt to one elongated thing, it makes another different shape look less elongated. Second idea is that genuine face attributives should be revealed in adaptation to right-side-up faces. The idea is that inverted faces, any adaptation effects you get are going to be for low-level properties. And here's what she did. She got a whole bunch of faces. She made a bunch of faces that differed from one another in the T shape made by the eyes, the nose, and the mouth. And you can see that this one has a much larger distance. This is the shortest. So her reasoning was this. So she looked at these are not false and true. These are face and T, okay? F and T are face and T. She looked at adaptation from face to T, face to face, T to face, T to T. And her reasoning was, to the extent that transfer is shape generic, by which she means low level, there's no reason to expect differences among these different items. To the extent that transfer that is adapting to one, the adaptation transfer to the other, is face specific, then the transfer between categories should be zero. And what she found was that in the case of upright faces, this is a quote from the paper, 55% of the after effect for upright faces had a face specific origin, while 45% had a shape generic origin shared between faces and T's. And in the case of inverted faces, almost all was shape generic, that is low level. That is, for inverted faces, this was pretty much the case. For upright faces, it was more like this, or really a combination. So anyway, the upshot is there is evidence for face-specific attributives, high-level attributives. That is, high-level representations. Okay, so now I should say, let me say a couple of things about this. First of all, I'm not claiming that all issues that philosophers are interested in about perception can be answered experimentally. I think that in the questions I'm interested in, there's a combination of empirical and relatively a priori methods. So there are some issues that could be raised about this work that may not have an experimental answer. Okay, so let me move to the issue of primary versus secondary seeing. So I quoted this from Begbie before, and I think what he's expressing here is the idea that if Burge claims we don't perceive CD players as such, there's something maybe a merely technical idea. And this was expressed when I gave this lecture in Oxford by Tim Williamson, who said, in the scientific sense of object, well, he didn't say this, but he wondered about it. He says, well, this is all about a scientific sense of seeing. It's not really about seeing in the sense in which we are interested in it, namely, and he specifically mentioned his college, New College. He says, look, we don't see New College in this technical sense. So my perspective on this is that we can ask an ordinary question, like which of these drinks has the most alcohol or which has more alcohol than the other, and we can ask an ordinary question that can only be answered by appealing to something somewhat technical. This isn't very technical, but we could ask whether it has, which has the most alcohol by weight or mass or volume. So the idea is that an ordinary question can have a technical answer that actually answers the ordinary question. So there's a relation between the there's the right relation between the technical notions and the ordinary notions. And in this case, I think there is. So I think we can make a distinction between primary seeing, which is seeing in which visual attributives are applied to what you might call visual objects, that is, objects that the demonstrative element in a percept picks out, and secondary seeing, which could be defined as hybrids of visual attributives and higher level non-visual conceptual attributives applied to visual objects, hybrids applied to things that are not visual objects, on the basis of the visual objects that compose them, like maybe New College, and maybe even property instances or events where there are no objects at all. So the answer to Begbie then would be, well, first of all, of course, we do see and we object see CD players and baseball bats in the scientific senses of see. It is doubtful that there are perceptual attributives that correspond to baseball bat or CD player. Now, I'm not saying that I know that there are no cultural specific attributives. I'm not saying that, but I doubt that those are them. Probably most of the high-level attributives, I'm guessing, have an evolutionary origin, like face, but maybe some that don't. So the thought is that we primarily see the bat as having these low-level properties, and we apply the perceptual concepts so that we're secondary seeing the bat in a sense as such, but it's a judgment with an applied concept. So what about New College? We primarily see some of the objects that compose New College. Some of the objects are visual objects. We apply primary visual attributives, and on the basis of them we apply the concept New College. So secondary seeing New College as such. So I think what we have here is a non-technical question that has a technical answer that answers the question. So let me say something about personal versus subpersonal representation. So many philosophers don't think that there are including quite a few in this room, who don't think there are visual representations. A very notable example of this is Charles Travis's The Silence of the Senses. And Travis says something that I've heard many, many times from philosophers, but his form of it is that nothing in this makes it illegitimate for cognitive psychologists in their account of the subpersonal processes involved in, say, vision, to speak of representations on which computations can be performed. My own view is that for such things to serve their explanatory ends, there is no need to see such representations as committed to anything being so as mistaken or not accordingly. They may simply represent, say, a color edge being at a certain position without representing it as so that it actually is there. Now, I'm not sure I disagree with this. I think one thing he may be getting at is the visual representations are not of a propositional form. Maybe they're like what Burge describes as an attributive attributed to an object without a copula. And so maybe that deserves the way he puts it. But the thing where I disagree is that these have to be subpersonal. So he says, the point is that the color, shape, and texture representations that are recognitionally equivalent to angry face, fearful face, female face, etc., are good candidates for being subpersonal. So the result that we have representations for angry face, etc., go against Travis. They're poor candidates for the subpersonal. And why do I say that? Because angry, fearful, gender specific, they're directly relevant to personal level concerns, whereas the color, shape, and texture, not always, but often, are only indirectly relevant to personal level concerns. Maybe they're both can be relevant to personal level concerns, but certainly the face ones are. So he says, representation yields only mediated awareness of what it represents as so, and I'm sure we could get into a long discussion of this. So my perspective on this is that representation is part of the machinery by which we are unmediatedly aware of the world. That is, we're unmediated in the sense that we're not aware of the representation. So Travis says, there is, I have argued, nothing in a perceptual experience to make it count as having some one representational content as opposed to countless others. And the adaptation methodology that I'm describing is a way of narrowing that indeterminacy down, saying which content. So I think that we're not without methods for doing this. So let me just move to the question of whether it's consciousness that makes the representations personal. I really don't think so, and one way I think we can see this, I'll give you two examples. One example is the example of blind sight. I'm sure everybody's heard of blind sight, where you get some destruction of the visual cortex and the person can answer questions based on stimuli directed to that area, but claims not to see it. We, I think, have some reason to think that person doesn't see it. Well, most of these patients have been partial destruction of early visual cortex, but there is one, I think now there's a second patient, a blind sight patient, who has the whole of the V1 early part of the visual cortex destroyed. And there was a paper in Current Biology in which he was asked to, apparently for the first time, to walk down a cluttered hallway, and you're going to see a little video of him doing this. And so this is so there he is. So that's Larry Weisskranz. This is the blind sight subject who's put away his cane and is walking down a cluttered hall. He says he sees nothing, but you notice that he is in fact avoiding the obstacles. Okay, so the point I'm trying to make is I think those can be reasonably regarded as personal level representations, even though they're unconscious. Here's another experiment, a completely different methodology, which I can't completely explain because it would take too long, and I'm running very low on time. But so this methodology is a methodology for making stimuli presented to one eye so that they are seen unconsciously. And the way it works is you have very brightly colored, rapidly moving stimulus in one eye, and then something else in the other eye. And what happens is this rapidly moving, this exploits a phenomenon known as binocular rivalry, in which one eye can take over the whole visual field. Your whole visual field is filled by this stimulus. People do not see this thing at all consciously. Okay, everybody understand the idea? Okay, so what you have is the thing making the experience, the percept of this, slowly decreasing in contrast. At the same time, the face that's presented to the other eye is increasing in contrast here up to a certain level, at which point it levels off. And the faces can be neutral, be fearful, happy, inverted, neutral, fearful, and happy. And what they want, the variable that they're interested in here was whether the expression on the face makes any difference to how fast the face breaks through the cloak of invisibility. And the answer is the fearful face breaks through faster. This is, I guess, 2 seconds. And the inverted happy face takes 3 seconds. So the idea is that you are unconsciously seeing the fearful face. It is having an effect that makes it faster to become conscious. And so that's what I just said. So I have two purposes of this. First of all, this helps to back up the idea that there actually are visual representations, not just, this is one representation that is first unconscious, then becomes conscious. The idea of supposing that that there may be unconscious representations, but not conscious ones, I don't think works. And the thought is then that the emotional content must have been present in the unconscious representations. So I'll leave this at that and now go on to the last and most difficult topic, which is percepts versus concepts. How do we know that adaptation targets percepts rather than concepts? So let me say the work I've been able to find that is relevant to this is there's just way less of it than the work that I've talked about so far, and maybe I'm not even going to have time to go into all of it. How much time do I actually have?
I've been speaking for 43 minutes.
Okay, I think I'm going to. This has been happening to me. I'll just go through some of this. I won't mention. I'll just skip through this. So remember Susanna's rich content thesis, and she says, I think rightly, that there's a problem for introspection to deciding between perception and post-perceptual cognition, and between visual phenomenology and cognitive phenomenology. I'll just give you one very quick example of this. So this is something called the phoneme restoration effect. So, I know I have to do this. Volume. That's muted. There we are. Okay.
Legislature.
Okay, you heard that. Now what you're going to hear is the word with the S sound replaced by a noise. Okay?
Legislature.
Okay, most people report that they heard an S sound. I don't know if you... whereas if you take it off altogether, you don't hear it.
Legislature.
Okay, so now I'm not going to play you the sounds for these other things, but here's the thing. People make reports like this. It's a little hard to tell from the reports. So here's another version of the phoneme restoration effect. It was found that the noise eel was on the axle. It was found that the noise eel was on the shoe. It was found the noise eel was on the orange. It was found that the noise eel was on the table. People often report that they heard wheel or heel or peel or meal, but it can't be perceptual. The percept is over by the time this word comes up. Okay? Now there are postdictive effects, but there's plenty of evidence that this is not one of them. I won't go into this more, but the idea I'm trying to illustrate is just from people's reports. It's really hard to tell. People are often not sure themselves whether they made a perceptual judgment or they had a percept. It can be very tricky to tease these things apart. I don't think there's any substitute for using some kind of experimental methods, although some people's introspection may be better than others. So when the subject says this looks fearful, can we be sure that this answer reflects perception rather than some kind of perceptual judgment? Now, there are a number of ways to try to approach this. One way is to use these various forms of ambiguous figures. So typically what happens with ambiguous figures is there is alternation between one interpretation and another. And that alternation has three well-known properties: exclusivity, inevitability, and randomness. Exclusivity is you get the percept of one. There may be a transitional period, but it's just the one thing, then and then the other thing all by itself. Inevitability is it's bound to happen, and randomness is you can't predict the time of one from the time of the previous one. And these are known, or at least some forms of them are known to be mainly due to a form of adaptation. So here's the interesting thing is that in this experiment, actually, I'm not sure they use this one as opposed to some other figures this is again more work by Mary Peterson. People were able to see the familiar, that is in the sense of things they've been exposed to. They could see the white shapes as figure faster, maintain them longer, only when the figures were right side up as opposed to rotated or inverted. And importantly, whether or not they knew what the figures were. So the idea is that the uprightness shows it has a perceptual component, but the fact that it worked independently of whether they knew what it was, and here's an example, you may not know what this is. I mean, how many don't know what that is? A few, okay. So even when that's a lamp, the black part is a lamp. Even when the subjects didn't know what it was, and a lot of these figures, it's very hard to tell what they are. I couldn't find one so quickly, so I brought one that's a little more obvious. So that suggests no conceptual component. Now we have to ask the question of whether we get these things with concepts. Now, let me just suggest, this is complete speculation on my part, but we have traditional philosophical conundra, of some of which I've listed. And I know that when you first hear these things, you tend to think, oh no, it's this, it's this thing. It's we have free will. No, it's determinism. We don't have free will. Or maybe there's something wrong with the question. Or we vacillate. But then after a while, we make up our minds, and then we can look at those things, stare at the problem, think about it, and it's always the same answer. Whereas in the case of adaptation, no matter how many times you've seen the thing, the interpretation still fluctuates in accordance with the three principles. So I think we're going to have to leave it at that. There is a method that can cast some light on it, but I don't have time to talk about it. So let me just conclude. So substantive conclusions and methodological conclusions. Substantive conclusions, there are methods for distinguishing empirically among a perceptual attributive, high-level attributive, the holistic constellations of low-level attributives that are recognitionally coextensive with the high-level attributives, and to a lesser extent, the conceptualized attributives that are constituents of thought or judgment rather than perception. Really, what I'm just trying to express is the idea that there are distinctions to be made here, and there are methods that are in principle able to give us some answers. Methodological conclusions, I think philosophers have underestimated the extent to which the following issues actually have an experimental component. I don't say that they're, maybe I shouldn't have said are experimental, I meant have an experimental component. Whether seeing as, whether seeing is exhausted by seeing low-level properties, shape, spatial relations, motion, texture, etc. Whether seeing as is conceptual, whether the distinction between, what the distinction is between perception and perceptual judgment, and how unspecific perception is. And I haven't had okay, anyway, I'll just leave it at that.
About the relationship between what you said about Burge and Travis. So this is about the part of your talk where you were replying to Travis. Mm-hmm. So you had a quote up from Travis that said there isn't anything that would make it the case that the experience or that the perception is representing things as being one way or another. And then your reply was to talk about the breaking through the cloak of invisibility with fear, rather than fear breaks through the cloak of invisibility sooner than happiness. But when you were talking about Burge, I thought you were endorsing Burge's view that the upper bound of perception just stops at that F. And so I took you to be agreeing with Travis up to a point when you said that, because you don't get something that's predicatively structured until beyond that boundary. So now I think as it happens, just as a sociological point, Travis would deny that there's even such a thing as that F in perception too, but let's just forget about him. The thesis he was attacking that you were replying to seemed to be one that you yourself were rejecting. So I feel like I'm not understanding what you're meaning by representation, because he's attacking the thesis that said, in that quote, he seemed to be attacking the thesis that said, there is such a thing as the condition under which what your experience is telling you actually happens. But if you just have that F, you don't seem to have that yet. You don't seem to have like an accuracy condition.
I think so maybe that quote doesn't say it, but I think he also means to say there are no personal level visual representations in which an attributive is applied to a thing in perception. So he also thinks that, maybe that quote didn't quite express that. He thinks there are no personal level visual representations at all. He thinks that there is no way of, there's no fact of the matter as to what such representations would be. Let me get that quote, actually. One of the... Okay, so I think it might be this one. Yeah, so look, there are grades of issues here. One is whether vision has content at all. Now, you could hold that as content, but maybe object involving content, which would be more in his direction. But he thinks that that they don't have content at all. What I was arguing is the methods that I was suggesting are relevant to the question of content, and particular representational content, like face content, expression content, as opposed to color, shape, and texture content.
You're agreeing with him that it doesn't have the kind of content where you could say that things really are the way the perception tells you they are.
Well, yeah,
you're agreeing with him.
I did say in here that he might that this issue of representing it as so might be something that I would agree with.
My question is really just for clarification about how to think about what high-level attributives are.
Okay.
If we don't take them as conceptual from the get-go.
Yeah.
So we're supposed to, the question is, do we have these high-level attributives? Being a dog was the example you used. So is that associated, correspond to the concept of being a dog right off the bat? I mean, how am I supposed to think about how that features an experience if it doesn't involve the application of a concept?
Okay, so the picture I'm trying to argue for is that there are certain attributives that are just produced by the visual system, that by early parts of the visual system, color shape. I'm calling that color shapes and textures, and then there is a question about whether the there are these, what I'm calling higher level ones. Now, I don't think that they can be, that anything to do with concepts is required for them, because I think animals can have those high level attributives. The thought is that to the extent that you can get evidence that, say, an animal has the attributive dog, which, my guess is you probably could find evidence of that, you have evidence for an attributive independently of the concept.
Why are you characterizing them as high level?
Because they're not in that list of ones produced by early vision. Galen?
On that, why don't dogs have concepts?
Why don't dogs have concepts?
Yeah.
Okay. Maybe they do. Maybe they have some concepts. I guess I'm expressing perhaps a prejudice that as you get lower in the phylogenetic scale, you're less likely to have the thought and reasoning which determine what the concepts you have are.
Well, you could wonder whether that concepts have to be parts of thoughts, and you could wonder whether animals have thoughts. But
yes, so you could wonder about whether concepts are parts of thoughts. I'm just really taking it as a stipulation that they are.
But actually, my question was a small one. I just wanted to know what you thought the personal level representations were for the man walking down the hall. What was their content?
Good question. Okay, so blind sight is there's little in the way of real form perception in blind sight, little in the way of real color perception. It's really more like non-constant color. So my guess is that whatever contents he had were pretty minimal. Certainly not box in the hallway or.
They were visual. I thought
what?
There wasn't any visual.
No visual phenomenology apparently, but unconscious representations of something that was good enough to allow him to avoid the things.
And that's okay. So I think I'm thinking that personal means conscious, and you denied that.
I'm denying that. Yeah.
Yeah. Okay.
No, I think they're personal level. Look, if you think personal level means conscious, you have to explain why the scared face pops out of the unconscious first. It must be that the difference between the fearful face and the happy face is a difference that is in some way reflected in its unconscious role. Alex?
Yeah, there's just a clarificatory question about the problem of recognitional coextension. So could we just have a concrete example? Let's take causation instead of faces. So let's assume that there are these low-level relations between some event A and some event B, which are correlated with A's causing B. Mm-hmm. Just to simplify, maybe the relation is just occurring right before. So it's agreed on all sides that there's a perceptual attributive corresponding to that relation. So I see A and B, and in my visual experience box is the sentence A occurred right before B. And then the issue is whether it's only in the belief or judgment box that some sentence like A caused B appears. Okay, so then if that's the issue, I didn't get how the experiments you mentioned could decide in favor of one as opposed to the other. You said that in some adaptation experiment you were describing that you could vary the low-level properties of the adapter without affecting the high-level appearance or judgment, and that was supposed to be a point in favor of the relevant sentence appearing in the visual experience box.
Yeah.
And not in the belief box. But sorry, how did that work exactly?
So the idea would be that you vary whatever low-level properties You can. So the idea is you would have, cause, where all those differ. Now,
But aren't they just different? Yeah, sorry, you go on.
However, what you are imagining is that there is a single coextension, being earlier than, in which case you couldn't vary that, so that method wouldn't do you much good.
Yeah, that was just for simplification, but I thought that the analog of the experiment in this very simple case would have been, well, look, we make A occur just a little bit before B, and now we make it occur before B, plus a second, and then plus 2 seconds, and we still get A caused B in every case. And maybe if we extend it to 4 seconds before, we now don't get A caused B. Well, obviously that wouldn't show.
No, that wouldn't. That would be of no use. No, you'd have to vary. Okay, so you'd have to vary. So what you vary depends on what your hypothesis is about what the low-level properties that are responsible for the appearance of the high-level property.
Sorry, here's another way of putting it.
Yeah.
I thought that on both hypotheses,
Yeah.
the sentence A caused B is only going to get generated if A is low-levelly related to B in such and such way.
Yeah.
And so the only issue is where that sentence is. Is it in the perception box or is it in the belief box?
Yeah.
But then it looks like
Well, we
if that's
see.
the issue, then varying.
Okay,
the
so
low-level
it's
stuff couldn't
so
decide.
cause is a tricky case. So the ones that I mentioned, we see methods for deciding. I mentioned the varying the low-level parts, but I mentioned another one, the face to T adaptation, which works. Goes between face and T perfectly well for inverted faces, but not for upright faces where it's about equal. So that methodology allows you to apportion the extent to which it's a low-level versus a high-level phenomenon. So I guess if I was going to try to do an experiment on this, I would try to think about how to do that in the case of causation. Now, the problem, as you described, is if you just vary if you think it's mainly time, and you vary the time, then really what you seem to be doing is varying the extent to which there is an elastic causal look. So that's obviously not the thing to vary. But offhand, I can't think of what you would do. But this is where experimental methodology, experimental inventiveness would be required. I would certainly be very suspicious of an argument that said it can't be done. Susanna?
I wanted to ask about a bit where you were talking about the fact that we have adaptation with regard to gender, faces, emotions, suggests that representations of those features is on a personal level, since emotions, faces, gender, and so forth is of personal level concern. And I mean, basically, I just want you to say a bit more about that, because it would, on the face of it, I wouldn't be surprising if something subpersonal could affect things that are of personal level concern. So it wasn't obvious to me why what you said was cut any ice on that matter.
Yeah. So I use the word direct. So the idea is that emotion and gender, et cetera, are directly relevant to personal level concerns. Look, I don't know what, of course, it's a term of art, personal, subpersonal distinction. For a representation, it seems like direct relevance to, the concerns of the person is certainly should be a big factor. For a process, it might be something more like something to do with whether it's something I myself do. So anyway, my answer is it's the directness.
So if something is directly relevant, then it needs to be on a personal level? Then it needs to be a representation on the personal level?
Well, that's certainly a reason.
Okay.
I guess given that reason, it seems to me to put the ball in the court of the person who claims it's subpersonal. I can see somebody trying to make the case that it's subpersonal. Certainly many people think, maybe you, that there aren't any personal level visual representations. I don't see that the case has been made.
I certainly think they're person level.
Yeah, okay, well, yeah, quite a few people. I think Mark thinks that there aren't any personal level visual representations. Yeah.
Question about the blindsight guy who avoids obstacles. So you were suggesting that he has representations that are personal level but unconscious. Question, I wonder whether they debrief the guy afterward and ask them, ask the guy, why did you decide to go in this direction then rather than in that direction? It seems to me as if probably he would say something like, oh, I felt that there was something there as opposed to,
Yeah.
I mean, if like literally no difference made to what it was like for him that the object was here rather than there, then presumably what it would be like to him, to be him is he's an automaton controlled by a hidden puppet master to make that step rather than the other step. Why not think that there are conscious, personal level, strange representations that vision science would know how to describe?
So I asked Weisskranz about this and got a very uninformative answer, so I can't really give you any real information on this. But certainly regular blindsight, the people say, so you say, was it an X or an O? And they say, I didn't see anything. Guess as between an X and an O. They can guess often at very high degrees of accuracy, but it's not a matter of anything like, I felt like it was that. At least that's not what when you read, unfortunately often they don't actually quote the subjects that much. Tony Marcel says that he threw a ball at or to a blind sight patient, and the guy just caught it because he didn't say what the guy said. So, Charlie, do you know anything about this?
Well, not very good evidence. Blind sight people have any recognition of color or shape, what the object is. They can largely recognize that something is moving, and they can avoid it. They can certainly avoid things by walking down the hall. But the fact that these visual processes accessible to blind sight person are not conscious is really similar to most of the bodily functions. All sorts of things are going on in all sorts of our bodies which we're not aware of. So why blind sight is so incredibly fascinating to philosophers puzzles me, whereas the process of digestion, for example, apparently are not.
Well, it's of interest to me because I'm making a claim here about personal level, using this personal, subpersonal distinction now. But
certainly there's at least this distinction that if somebody asks me why I decided to digest the food this way rather than that way, I would have no idea whatsoever how to answer the question because I have no rational control over my digestion whatsoever. But presumably, if I decide to pick this up rather than that up, if I decide to pick this up why I go like that, I can explain why I went like that. It was there, and that's how I picked something like that up.
Somebody with blind sight doesn't pick up A or B. Simply will avoid bumping into A or B.
Okay, but do we know what they say about why they decided to move this way rather than that way?
Well, they make it very clear either that they saw nothing, or they quote had some sense.
They had some sense. Okay,
some feeling.
It strikes me as completely premature to say that there's absolutely nothing it's like for these guys in virtue of which they're reacting to the environment as they do. There is something that's like, they have a feeling.
I think that, look, there's only one patient study that I know of. I think there's supposed to be a second, but I haven't seen any written thing, and we don't have the descriptions for these people. Weisskranz always said that when we finally found a bilateral, that is both sides of V1 destroyed, we might find a very different phenomenon, and apparently it is somewhat different. Yes, back there?
Well, when you have animals, when you have monkeys who have a bilateral disruption of striate cortex,
Yeah,
they avoid objects.
yeah.
They walk down the hall and they don't bump into things.
Yeah, and they pick up on it. There's a famous monkey.
Of course, we can't ask a monkey why they did it.
Yeah.
But when you ask the person why they did it, you don't get an answer either.
They have a feeling. It's not a very good answer. But, yeah.
Does somebody have something relevant to this particular topic? Yeah.
It's fairly relevant. It's also on the question of blind sight. So, I think I probably talk loud enough that you don't have to give me the microphone. So I was wondering, it seems like there are two sort of related cases that have very different stories, and there's some sense in which the blind sight cases seem like they're sort of ambiguous between these two. So in one, the cases of like DR, where you have basically there's two visual systems. One is responsible for
DR, you mean DF?
or DF. Yes, sorry, yeah, DF, yeah.
So we should explain. This is a perceptual agnostic who can see colors and textures, but can't recognize objects.
Right. And so we know that things like moving around objects, grasping a spoon the way you would grasp a spoon without being able to recognize consciously that it's a spoon. So there's sort of that kind of explanation of the blind sight patient's behavior in navigating the obstacles in his way. And then there's another sort of example that I think seems more suggestive of there being sort of genuine subpersonal contents. But then the question is, to what degree do we think concepts ought to be involved in these cases, or can we think of them separately from concepts? And that would be the case of like the highway driver cases or whatever. Now it's sort of questionable to what extent we can really say those people are lacking phenomenology or like consciousness of what they're doing, but there you have the interpretation of very sort of high-level symbols, road signs, etc. So I wasn't sure whether the blind sight case is supposed to be more like there are meaningful things in the environment, so they really seem sort of person level, or if it's sort of more of a DF case where there could just be mechanisms that allow us to navigate things that might not have anything like visual contents at all, conscious or not.
Yeah, so it's like the DF case. So you have this patient who you show the patient a slot that can be tilted at any angle. The patient has a card to put in the slot. You say, tell me, is that slot vertical or horizontal? And the patient says, I don't even really see a slot, I have no idea, but she sees something. Post the card through the slot and she can post it about as accurately as a normal person. So according to me, there are personal level representations in the dorsal visual system that are guiding that behavior. Yeah, Charlie?
Well, I think we were confusing two different subdivisions of the visual system. Blind sight, we know from experiments on monkeys, is dependent on the superior colliculus. And apparently, activity in the superior colliculus is not acceptable to consciousness. That's A. But this business of the slides putting in has nothing to do with it. It rather reflects the differences between the dorsal and ventral visual system. Going to cortex, the dorsal system being specialized for detection of movement and the detection of spatial location, and the ventral system being concerned primarily with the detection of form, of color and shape. And so the case, so there are people therefore who have their primary impairment in either the dorsal or ventral system, and therefore either although they can't recognize shapes, they can put things into slots. So this is a completely different dichotomy from the blind side, which is a cortical, superior colliculus distinction.
Yeah, but I think they're similar in that they're unconscious representations that are relevant to personal level concerns. So I'm lumping those two together. See, Chris, you had.
Yes. Thank you. So I'd like to explore a little bit more of the idea, I think you're endorsing, that the upper bound of perception was the that F content. And I have a couple of questions. One is, on your diagram, you had the transition from the that F at the perceptual level then to the judgment level, that is F. That may work for that case, but if you want the idea that you're perceiving relations, you perceive A as above B and so forth, it's not at all clear how to extend that at all to those cases. What you're in effect rejecting by saying this is the upper bound of perception is really any idea of non-conceptual content with correctness conditions at the genuinely perceptual level. It's an issue to which Susanna was alluding. I wonder if you could say a little bit more about why you're doing that, why you're taking that stance, because a lot of what you say would be entirely consistent with acknowledging a level of non-conceptual representational content, and you could take a lot of this as evidence of where we should draw those boundaries. But it seems to me we need the notion of non-conceptual representational content with correctness conditions.
Well, so I'm allowing for non-conceptual content, just not non-conceptual content with truth conditions. But there's a kind of accuracy condition, which is that that the thing designated by the that really does have the property designated by the F.
But how do you do that in the relational case, that this is above that? You can't put that in the this F or that
true.
F form.
Yeah.
It applies to the causation case too. You've got two events. You're perceiving even talking about the spatial temporal relations between them, discussing whether you're really just touching on that. You need the perception of this as time relation to that.
I hadn't really thought about the relational case. I'll have to think about that. Jeremy?
I'd like to know a bit more about how you're thinking of this distinction between something being at the level of perception or at the level of judgment, given that the way people have traditionally tried to draw that distinction is in terms of cases of known illusion, where you're looking at the moral liar lines and the thought is they appear to be of different lengths, but you don't judge them to be of different lengths, allegedly. That can't be the way of drawing the distinction clearly that's relevant to you. So I was just wondering if you could say a bit more about what it would mean to be at the level of judgment and not at the level of perception, even in a case, say, of known illusion, where you don't, as it were, believe that the thing is the way that it seems.
Okay, so I'm thinking of the perceptual system as roughly encapsulated, the conceptual system in which the concepts are the components of the judgments, as not encapsulated, as perception is iconic, judgment is not. I mean, is there something wrong with that characterization?
No, there's nothing wrong with lumping together certain, features that have a life in cognitive psychology and saying that a phenomenon takes place at a level of representation that has or that doesn't have those features. But then it makes these questions really depend on the cognitive psychology of those features. So, for example, if perceptual experience turns out to be less encapsulated than people have previously thought, say, in the way that Susanna has explored a lot in recent work, then that could be a thing where, from your perspective, you lose a grip on the question to some degree of what we were even talking about in distinguishing perception and cognition. Although there might still be enough left of the perception role, say the iconic aspect, for there still to be some question there. You feel like you start to lose a grip on what's happening.
Yeah. Okay, so the picture I'm operating from is a picture where the right way to answer the question of what the distinction is between perception and cognition is to look at the relevant sciences. At least that's the place to start. Now, I do acknowledge that there will be conceptual aspects of it that you have to bring in. So the issues, the questions will be have a combination of conceptual and empirical methods, but it looks from the science that to me that there's a pretty solid distinction there, and so I'm relying on that.
Well, I want to go back. It may be relevant to go back to a much earlier question when you're talking about early visual areas and later visual areas. To note, and you related this to the problem of concepts and percepts and so on. I would note that the visual system of the of the rhesus monkeys, say, as far as we know, is identical to that of humans. And the difference between, yes, there's a bit more complexity, there may be a few more areas in humans, but the difference between, say, a macaque and humans is less than between a macaque and a marmoset. And so whatever you want to attribute to concepts and percepts and so on, they got to be true in animals too.
No, I know that, and I
It's
like
the
that
same-
fact.
It's the same substrate. And so
yeah.
any visual phenomena, I believe, that are known in humans, like this illusion and that illusion, if you test for it in animals, animals show a Mueller-Lyer illusion too.
Yeah.
Whatever illusion people have tested for, I shouldn't say animals, monkeys show it too.
Even parrots.
Sorry?
Even parrots.
Well, no, parrots, that's unfair to bring in either parrots or crows, because we know that the cognitive ability of a crow and a parrot is far superior to that of a monkey and is comparable to that of a chimpanzee.
Yeah, but I'm talking about their perceptual systems. The Alex the parrot was shown to be subject to the Mueller-Lyer illusion. Yeah, so I agree with that. I think a big advance in studying consciousness was to realize that you didn't need language for consciousness, and that so you could study the perceptual systems of animals. I completely agree. So let's see, Zoe?
Yeah, so this is going back to the adaptation solution to the recognitional coextension problem. So in the first case you gave us with the stripes and the circles, part of the support for thinking it was a perceptual effect was the receptor fatigue you mentioned, but then in the face case with the anger and the fear, there wasn't something analogous to that. So
Wasn't something analogous to what?
to the receptor fatigue. We don't have data about
Yeah, yeah.
fear receptors getting
Right.
exhausted.
Yeah, yeah.
So it seems like it's an open possibility that, sure, there's some adaptation going on, but it's a cognitive sort of adaptation, that we get used to making a fear judgment. And so the explanation of why we say the neutral face is angry is something cognitive as opposed to a perceptual effect.
Yeah. Okay, so remember that the Eleanor McCone study I reported with the squat and the elongated did suggest that this isn't expressions, but it's faces, that there are face-specific attributives. And I did, examine a few ideas about how to distinguish, not very good ones, but ideas about how to distinguish concepts from high-level attributives. Now, in the case of expressions, the issue is complicated by the fact that there are two different kinds of adaptation going on. There's one kind where it appears that there are something like the angle representations that were involved in the tilt after effect. But there's also an opponent process system that shows a different kind of adaptation, and these can be distinguished empirically. So it's a kind of complicated thing, and I agree that I didn't say enough about this, but I didn't, yeah.
Yeah, so I had a related question, which was that it wasn't clear to me why we couldn't use the adaptation results to merely give a non-technical answer to the question, what do we see things as? So because with both the slants and the fear faces and the angry faces, we're using people's judgments about what the neutral faces look like. And so we're supposing people are reporting their perceptual experience, and that's modified in these various ways. So that would be, we could use those results to say what people perceive things as without bringing in questions of the form of representation, whether it's conceptual or non-conceptual. So my suggestion is that suppose we take the adaptation results at face value. It seems like all they show is what we see things as. And then all of these further questions about non-conceptual content versus conceptual content, or whether perception is representational, it seems like we can fight about that even granting all of the adaptation results. So I was wondering how you thought the adaptation results bear on those kinds of questions.
So if somebody says, do I see a face as a face? If I'm going to answer this question based on some of the experiments I mentioned, I'm going to have to say, well, do I see a face as a face like a bunch of colors and shapes and textures, or do I see it literally as a face, using a face attributive? And we're already in the realm of the technical.
Well, so I don't see what extra using it as, so using face as an attributive, which is a technical notion, I don't see what that adds over and above the answer to the question of you see it as a face, not just as a collection of colors. It seems like the adaptation results do bear on that question, or at least if you grant them. I don't see why you would think that they bear on the further questions of whether or not perception is representational or whether it's conceptual or non-conceptual.
Well, I'm not unsympathetic with your point of view, but I think that if as soon as somebody asks a further question, it might become clear that when a person says, using ordinary thinking, see a face as a face, they're not distinguishing among a number of different possibilities. So I think to really answer it, you've got to say something about those different possibilities. Paul?
So it's again a question about the difference between perception or percept and concept. So I was wondering whether in the cases what you presented where we hear a sentence and some segment of the sentence gets replaced or gets screened and we perceive something very quickly, it seems that, I guess this is the way some people would describe it, some low-level inferences are going on. So let's say in a particular context, I very quickly do a sort of Bayesian inference, right, as to what sound here is the most likely sound to be heard. And it seems that in the cases of face perception that you presented, we could say, well, in the cases in which you see a face in its normal orientation, you have some priors on your computation. Now, if you invert the face, the priors are totally different, but you're still doing the same kind of inferences. So my question is, if you think that any kind of seeing as depends on those Bayesian inferences, would you say then that the distinction between, let's say, perception and conceptual representation is just a matter of degree rather than, something else?
No, I think the Bayesian picture can't tell you the difference between a conjury of low-level properties and an actual high-level conjury of low-level attributives and a real high-level attributive. So I think you need to bring in these, some, not necessarily the adaptation, but you need to bring in something else like the adaptation work to distinguish. Mark?
Again, it's on this question of how far the adaptation results are to be taken as adaptation to the percept rather than the concept. As Charlie was emphasizing, we have a pretty good grip on the extent of the visual system. And so one methodology might just be to look at processing times. Now that's confounded by something you mentioned, which is the post-dictive character of a lot of visual experience. It's as if the brain waits for a while, gets some more information, maybe for 80 to 110 milliseconds, gets some more information before it creates the final percept. So is this, for example, you mentioned in the case of the phoneme filling in that this wasn't a post-dictive phenomenon, and I'd just like to hear why it isn't a post-dictive phenomenon in that case. After all, this stuff is, quite ubiquitous, and it's very primitive in the visual system, as is shown by the flash lag illusion and the Engelmann version. When you make the thing go the other way, you can actually get the evidence that the brain is waiting a considerable period of time. I think he's got up to 120 milliseconds in order to create the percept. Yeah.
Yeah. So now I don't have the numbers in my head for how the phoneme restoration effect works, but post-dictive effects are generally thought to have a upper bound in the 200 to 300 millisecond range. There are some masking effects that can take as long as 800 milliseconds, but with the those sentences, you're way beyond that. So I think just the timing alone is enough to be pretty confident that those things are not anything like the standard kind of postdictive effects. Look, ideally, part of the part of the talk that I skipped, it has an imaging component where you make use of the fact that Charlie mentioned, that we at least have a fairly good idea of what the visual system is. Of course, there can be issues as to whether there are concepts in the visual system, and so these all call for delicate reasoning. But in the case, so there's never going to be a single experiment that shows something. It's always going to be a combination of a lot of things trying to create the best picture. Howard?
Can I go back to Michel and Galen's original worry? I mean, Wittgenstein was concerned because he didn't think there was going to be any consciousness, or he thought without language. It wasn't concepts that were doing the work there.
Yeah.
And it's still not clear to me what it is for something to be non-conceptual if it involves the recognition of a universal, which properties are, the assimilation of that as such, and its use in further cognitive operations. So what is the distinction between that being a very primitive form of conceptualization, well below the language level where we get to languages and grammar, and it being non-conceptual at all? What's the issue there?
Okay, well, I'm just going to repeat what I said before, which is that I think there's reason to think there's a joint in nature here, and it has to do with two factors. One is the extent to which the information is widely available in the mind. So the perceptual systems, there's this term informationally encapsulated. The idea is, the famous example from Fodor's book, The Modularity of Mind, is that you have the Muller-Lyer illusion. You can measure it, and you can see that the lines are equal, but they still look different. So the idea is that the information that is in your conceptual system just does not penetrate into the perceptual system. So that relative information isolation, encapsulation versus inferential promiscuity. So that's one difference, and the other is the alleged difference in format. That you're dealing, in the case of perception, with iconic representations as opposed to so-called discursive representations. So there's format and computational roles. So now you can argue with both of those things, but that seems to me to justify the use of the word concept to apply to the representations in the cognition system, which are and percept to use for the perceptual systems, the encapsulated iconic perceptual system. So I'm basing it on that. I'm basing it on a joint in nature, and using the terminology is key to that. Now, of course, you can use the word concept in a lot of different ways, but the key thing for me in replying to Wittgenstein is that there is a kind of perception, a kind of attributive that is on the perception side, not the conception side.
So am I misunderstanding this? If it's a conceptual, then you'll think it differently if you learn that it's wrong.
Oh, well, roughly, yeah.
Yeah, but that's not going to apply to all sorts of higher order perceptions, is it? I mean, if something looks to me to be an elephant, or even a CD player, if I learn it isn't really, it's not going to stop it looking like one. So you're not going to be able to use that distinction to distinguish between higher order and lower order perceptual thing.
Well, look, you don't have to accept the. So I see. So the idea is, yeah. Okay. Yeah.
Okay.
Okay.
Okay. I'm not sure if I would be in the same wavelength of the gentleman, but just try to be brief. you said a lot of things that sometimes overwhelming. But in the process of learning, we may have two components: perception and the understanding of it. Perception representing or bringing all the representation of the object we want to know, and our position as a mind trying to give sense to that flow of representation. We have the mind understanding. But there's something what you put there that is said that in the conceptualization, the content of thought rather than the content of perception may be the predominant one. We may not be seeing the baseball bat or the DVD because we are more impressed by the color, shape, texture of it. So this is a kind of, since the epistemological viewpoint, kind of source of hopelessness. So we, as a knower, those that try to comprehend something from reality, if we see that way, what is that one we are knowing? The picture of what we think we are seeing, or the object picture itself? So we are going back maybe to the Cartesian level or Kantian level, where finally, or Nietzsche level, when he may say that finally what we know, finally is nothing. Just if we're trying to reach some kind of truth, may not be truth. Truth may not be but anything else but a kind of error. So finally, we have some hope to have some sense of grasping some sort of solid knowledge of what we're trying to learn. That would be my general question, sir.
Yeah, that's kind of, the issues involved in, skepticism and, realism about the external world are kind of orthogonal to the issues I'm talking about. You could really hold various positions on those issues while agreeing with what I say about perception versus cognition. So, I think those are real important issues and much discussed, but they're not really that relevant to what I'm talking about.